Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea reports its highest daily number of coronavirus cases in 5 months. 297 cases concentrated in the capital, prompting new social distancing measures. A top Chinese government official, Jiechi, will be visiting South Korea this week for talks with National Security Director Seo-hun. Among other things, they'll be discussing a visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping. And the Finance Ministry announces measures that'll make charging monthly rent less attractive to landlords who'll be encouraged to stick with the system of accepting big deposits in lieu of rent. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korea has reported almost 300 new cases of COVID-19, the most since early March. Stronger social distancing guidelines have been issued, but the Prime Minister says the outbreak is not at the stage where social distancing needs to be raised to the highest level, level 3. Choi Won-jung has our top story.
The South Korean government has announced a new set of much stricter social distancing guidelines after seeing large cluster infections linked to local church in Seoul. The nation is still officially at social distancing level 2, but the stricter guidelines will be imposed in Seoul, Gyeonggi-do province, and the western city of Incheon. Starting Wednesday, under the guidelines of social distancing level 2, all gatherings of more than 50 people indoors and more than 100 outdoors are prohibited. Schools must limit the number of students, and no spectators will be allowed at sports games. In addition, all religious facilities are prohibited from holding worship service in person. Some public facilities such as museums, libraries, and art galleries are closed as well. Seoul also added the closure of 12 types of designated high-risk facilities. Most of these facilities, including host and hostess bars and clubs, have been closed for a while already. But now gyms, singing rooms, buffet restaurants, and PC rooms have to close as well. Prime Minister Jeong-se said on Tuesday that the people and government must work together.
If we can restore control of our quarantine system now, the level of social distancing measure has to be upgraded to the 3rd level, which will impact South Korea's economy and people's daily lives.
As of Wednesday, South Korea confirmed 297 new cases of COVID-19. Of those, 283 were transmitted locally. 150 were reported in Seoul and 94 in Gyeonggi-do province. In total number of cases in the country stands at 16,058 with no additional deaths, maintaining the death toll at 306. Choi Won-jung, Arirang News.
South Korea has extended its worldwide travel advisory by another month as COVID-19 cases surge at home and abroad. The advisory says people should avoid traveling overseas and be extra careful if they're overseas right now. The Foreign Ministry says it'll stay in place until at least September 18th, affecting regions not already covered by tighter restrictions. The ministry has now extended the advisory 4 times since it was first imposed in March. The advisory will be automatically lifted on September 19th if it's not extended again. Top Chinese diplomat Jiechi will be visiting South Korea later this week for talks with National Security Advisor Seo-hun. Seoul's presidential office said Wednesday that Yang, a leading official in the Communist Party of China, is scheduled to be in the southern port city of Busan from Friday through Saturday.
National Security Advisor Seo-hun will be holding talks with Yang Jiechi on Saturday morning, which will be followed by a lunch meeting. The two officials will likely share their views on bilateral issues, including the COVID-19 response, high-level exchanges, and Korean Peninsula affairs.
Seoul's top office added that a potential visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping will also be discussed. South Korea and China have been working on the matter, but the visit has yet to materialize due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yang's visit would mark the first high-level visit from China since the outbreak. He last visited South Korea in 2018. The South Korean government is taking yet more measures in the housing market. Korean landlords traditionally accept large deposits instead of rent, but now more of them want to get cash flow, so they're trying to charge by the month. New regulations aim to discourage that by making rent less attractive to landlords. Kim Da-mi reports.
In a bid to lift the burden of tenants in South Korea, the nation's finance chief Hong Nam-gi has lowered the conversion rate for Jeonse-to-monthly rent from the current 4% to 2.5%. Under the old rules, a homeowner was required to receive 4% of a Jeonse contract as a monthly rental fees if the owner wanted to switch the agreed Jeonse contract into a monthly rental or 월세 contract. Hong's decision was reached Wednesday after the ministry's third housing market meeting.
The current 4% conversion rate for Jeonse to monthly rent only expedites tenants converting to rent and increases the burden on tenants who don't own their own home.
Jeonse is a rental system unique to South Korea, where the tenant gives the homeowner a lump sum of money, which is returned in full after the lease expires, usually after 2 years. The lower conversion rate means lower rent for tenants. For instance, a homeowner lowers the lump sum from $500,000 to $300,000 and takes the rest through monthly rent. With the 4% conversion rate, the rent becomes around $660 a month. But with a 2.5% rate, it's only $420. Thus, the new measures are aimed at deterring homeowners switching from Jeonse to monthly rent. Experts hope that the revised rate will alleviate the Jeonse to rent converting trend, but they also express the need for stronger government controls and monitoring. On top of that, the government will expand public access to moving in notifications. That's to prevent homeowners refusing to extend the leases to rent their homes to others for a higher amount. Hong also pledged to speed up a government plan to start building more housing units in the capital area as early as September. Noting the latest measures are slowly cooling down South Korea's overheated housing market, the Finance Ministry vowed to closely monitor the market situation. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
South Korea's household debt grew at a faster pace in the second quarter as people took out more home mortgage loans. According to the Bank of Korea, as of June, household debt reached a record high of $1.38 trillion. Mortgage lending continued to rise from the quarter before, but the rate of increase was slower. Mortgage loans rose more than $12.5 billion on quarter, now standing at more than $739 billion. Korea's household debt has been repeatedly cited as a factor that could hold back domestic demand. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, thank you for making time today.
Happy to be here.
Well, overnight on Wall Street, the S&P hit a new all-time high. The Dow Jones fell, though, by 0.25%. What's the story in the global markets?
Okay, well, as you just mentioned, the Dow has been falling a little bit, but S&P and NASDAQ has been doing very well. And S&P actually hit an all-time high on Tuesday. So even though the economic news, if you look at it objectively, has not been that good this week. So again, there seems to be a disconnect between the real economy and the stock market, not only in the United States, but globally as well. But let's take a look at the United States in more detail. The biggest reason people say that there is a disconnect between the real economy and the stock market is continuing low interest rate by the Fed and the high liquidity driven by the very expansionary monetary policy. And because of this, there's a bit of a perverse case going on here because the continuing bad news in the economy makes the Fed maintain the low interest rate, and that is one of the reasons why the stock market is doing so well. Another reason is that earnings and performance of companies have been down substantially compared to last year, but they're doing better than what the analysts expected. So they're not as bad as the analysts predicted. So because of those two reasons, people seem to be optimistic about stocks, even though the underlying news on the stocks are perhaps not as good. Now, one exception to this is the tech stocks. Tech firms are genuinely doing well, partially because of the shutdown. People working from home, people not being able to go out, so entertaining themselves through the internet. That has really increased the value of these tech companies. S&P is rated by the market value firms, and the three major tech companies that are in the S&P, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon, has been driving the increase in the S&P stock index. Amazon is up about 80% this year. Apple is up almost 60%. Microsoft has risen by more than 34%. If you took these three companies out from S&P, the return on owning S&P 500 stocks, including dividends, is said to be about minus 4.1%. But if you add these three companies back in, the actual return is 2.4%. So these tech companies are doing a lot to drive up the S&P market, in addition to the low interest rate and high liquidity mentioned earlier. European markets are not doing very well this week because of the China-U.S. conflict. Asian market, Shanghai and Hang Seng are doing fairly well this week. It rose on Monday and Tuesday, but their market isn't closed today, but it's falling today so far. Japan Nikkei has been falling this week. That's probably the aftermath of their very low second quarter growth rate announcement, minus 7.9% quarter to quarter. For Korea, I'm sorry to say that we had a major drop-off yesterday that continued from a slight drop that we had last Friday. But both markets did gain today a little bit. Kospi rose by 0.52%, Kosdaq by 2.31%. Obviously, the biggest contributor to the dropping stock market in Korea is the higher infection rate for coronavirus in the Seoul metropolitan area and the renewed stronger distancing measures. But the U.S.-China trade war seems to be doing its part as well. The trade war seems to be getting worse, not better. And then, of course, the global environment where everything is unsure is also making the markets quiver quite a bit, not only in Korea, but throughout the rest of the world.
Yeah, staying here in Korea, and speaking of trade, exports last month we see were down compared to a year earlier by 7.1%. That's a smaller decline than it had been in the 3 months prior to July. Tell us about that and what stands out to you in this figure. Okay, well, customs and the government side paints an optimistic picture because, well, as you just mentioned, the rate of decline has been falling. In April and May, the decline was higher than 20%. In June, it was 10.8%, but July, it's only 7.1% negative. But if you look at the last year's numbers, the last year's numbers from June to November were not very good either. For example, June last year fell by 13.8% compared to June 2018. July last year fell by 11.1% compared to July 2018. So in a sense, we're starting from a lower base because the last July was a very bad year for exports as well. But still, I think we should take hope wherever we can get it. And the hope in these July statistics is that semiconductors exports rose by 5.5%. Shipbuilding rose by 18.8%. And I think shipbuilding is really an optimistic figure because, well, why build more ships? Because they expect more trade, more volume of transport in the future. So people are betting that this crisis will be over eventually and we'll have a recovery in trade, and that's why you need more ships. So the increase in shipbuilding order, I think, has a significance beyond just how it feeds into Korea's exports. But I'm sorry to say that the other major export items, such as auto, petrochemicals, wireless communications equipment, did not do well. In terms of regions, China and U.S. rose because, well, China is recovering from the coronavirus. United States, they had a bit of a surprise growth in June and July, but other regions such as Vietnam, EU, and Japan, exports
by Korea fell. And it's a big question on whether the U.S. exports to the U.S. will continue to rise because, well, they still haven't been able to control their coronavirus. And imports by Korea fell by 11.6%. That's usually a sign, if you have such a large negative decline in imports, that there is a domestic recession, and that seems to be continuing.
Well, speaking of the virus, it's spreading again in the Seoul area. There has been hopes for a V-shaped recovery to happen in the third quarter this year, but some say that's in jeopardy now. We're almost out of time, but what do you think, Professor?
Okay, well, previously, because U.S. and China was recovering, the hopes for V-shaped recovery was, I thought it would depend on the United States. If the United States got on a growth path by controlling the coronavirus, Korea had a decent chance of making a V-shaped recovery. But now, Korea, as well as other countries, they're seeing increases in coronavirus. And if Korea goes into a strengthened distancing and other countries go back into a limited lockdown and shutdown as well, then Korea is hit on both domestic and export fronts, and that's going to make a V-shaped recovery pretty much impossible. Of course, this is too early to measure yet. Korea may get lucky. We may just have to use strengthened distancing measures for 2 weeks. U.S. may actually go back to the growth path. But for now, the V-shaped recovery seems a lot harder than it did 2 weeks ago.
For sure. We're all hoping for the best, though, Professor. Thanks so much for coming on today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.